In the sprawling, sun-drenched hills of Bel Air, Los Angeles, where mansions sit behind high iron gates and the air smells of jasmine and money, lived a legend. Neil Diamond, the man whose voice had defined a generation, the icon who filled stadiums from London to Sydney, lived a life of quiet luxury. But behind the platinum records and the glittering awards, the true heartbeat of his home was not a fellow celebrity or a business manager. It was Maria. Maria was a woman of 60, with hands calloused from decades of scrubbing floors and a face etched with the gentle lines of a life spent serving others. She was an immigrant from Mexico who had worked as Neil's housekeeper for over 25 years. She knew how he took his coffee, black, 2 sugars. She knew when he was writing a song and needed silence, and she knew the silence of his house better than anyone. To the world, she was invisible, just another uniform in the background of fame. But to Neil, she was the woman who made his house a home. She hummed Sweet Caroline while she dusted the piano, never dreaming that the man who wrote it was listening from the doorway with a smile. Maria's life outside the mansion was a stark contrast to the marble halls she cleaned. She lived in a modest, cramped neighborhood in East Los Angeles, where the houses stood shoulder to shoulder and the sound of sirens was more common than birdsong. Her pride and joy was her son, Gabriel. Gabriel had grown up on the stories of Mr. Neil. He had gone to college on the money his mother earned, scrubbing those marble floors. He was a good man, a hard worker, and he was about to marry the love of his life, a nurse named Elena. The wedding was going to be a humble affair, a rented community hall, plastic chairs, homemade tamales, and a DJ who was a cousin of a friend. It was all they could afford, but it was rich in love. One afternoon, weeks before the wedding, Maria stood in Neil's kitchen, wringing her hands in her apron. She was terrified. In her culture, it was respectful to invite the patron to major life events. But she knew the social gap was an ocean too wide to cross. Neil walked in to get a glass of water and saw her distress. "Maria, is everything okay?" he asked, his deep, familiar voice filled with concern. Maria took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she pulled a simple cream-colored envelope from her pocket. "Mr. Neil, sir, my Gabriel. He is getting married. I know you are a very busy man. I know you have big parties to go to, but it would be an honor just to give you this invitation. You don't have to come. It is just a small party, not for people like you." Neil took the envelope. He looked at the cheap paper, the handwritten calligraphy done by Maria herself. He looked at Maria, a woman who had practically raised his own children, who had nursed him through flu seasons and heartbreak, who had never asked for a raise, never stolen a dime, never sold a story to the press. He saw the fear of rejection in her eyes. "Maria," Neil said, a soft smile playing on his lips, "this is the most important invitation I've received all year." Maria beamed, thanked him profusely and went back to work, fully expecting him to send a nice card and maybe a toaster as a gift. She never imagined he would actually show up. How could he? He was Neil Diamond. He belonged to the world, not to a community hall in East LA. The day of the wedding arrived. The community hall was decorated with white crepe paper and balloons. The air was thick with the smell of roasting pork and excitement. Families gathered, dressed in their Sunday best. It was a beautiful, noisy, chaotic celebration of working-class love. Gabriel stood at the altar in a rented tuxedo that was slightly too big, waiting for his bride. The guests took their seats on the folding chairs. There was a buzz of happiness, but also the underlying stress of a family stretching their budget to the limit to make this day perfect. Then, just as the ceremony was about to begin, a hush fell over the parking lot outside. It wasn't the sound of the bride arriving. It was the sound of a heavy engine, a purr of expensive machinery that didn't belong in this neighborhood. A sleek black limousine, long and polished like a mirror, turned the corner and pulled up to the curb, right in front of the peeling paint of the community center. The guests froze. Conversations stopped. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Who could it be? A politician? A drug lord? The police? Maria, sitting in the front row, felt her heart stop. She looked at the door. The driver, dressed in a sharp black suit, stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. A polished black boot stepped onto the cracked pavement, then a leg in designer trousers, and then, stepping out into the afternoon sun of East LA, wearing a simple but elegant suit, holding a guitar case in one hand and a wrapped gift in the other, was the solitary man himself. Neil Diamond had not just sent a card. He had come. And he hadn't come as a superstar with an army of bodyguards to push people away. He had come as a guest. He walked toward the open doors of the humble hall, his presence sucking the air out of the room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gasp of Maria, who stood up, her hands covering her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. The legend had walked off the stage and into her life. The silence that gripped the community hall was thicker than the walls. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for cathedrals or the presence of royalty, not for a rented room in East LA with peeling paint. Neil Diamond walked down the center aisle, not with the swagger of a rock star accustomed to screaming fans, but with the gentle, respectful gait of a family friend, arriving late. He bypassed the head table, bypassed the stunned groom, and walked straight to the small woman in the second row who was trembling in her polyester dress. Maria tried to stand, to bow, to revert to her role as the servant, but Neil didn't let her. He dropped his guitar case to the floor with a heavy thud and wrapped her in a bear hug that lifted her slightly off the ground. "I told you I was coming, Maria," Neil whispered, his voice audible to the frozen room. "You didn't think I'd let you handle all this joy by yourself, did you?" He released her and turned to Gabriel, the groom, who looked as if he might faint. Gabriel had grown up seeing this man on album covers, hearing his voice on the radio while his mother cleaned, but seeing him here, in the flesh, smelling of expensive cologne and genuine kindness, was a glitch in his reality. Neil extended a hand. "Gabriel," he said warmly, "your mother talks about you while she works. I feel like I watched you grow up from the other side of the kitchen island. Congratulations, son." The room collectively exhaled. The tension broke, replaced by a low, buzzing murmur of disbelief. "It's really him," people whispered. "Look at his hair. Look at his eyes." But Neil didn't go to a VIP section. There wasn't one. He simply pulled up a metal folding chair next to Maria, sat down, and placed the wrapped gift on his lap. When the waiters, cousins of the bride, came around with plates of carnitas and rice on paper plates, Neil didn't ask for silverware or a special menu. He ate with a plastic fork, complimenting the salsa, laughing at the jokes of Maria's uncle sitting next to him. In that moment, the superstar dissolved. He was just a man enjoying a wedding, but the magic truly began when the speeches were over, and the DJ, a young kid named Ricky who was shaking so hard he could barely hold his microphone, tried to announce the first dance. The sound system gave a screech of feedback. The mood faltered. Neil stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He just sensed the room needed a leader. He walked over to his guitar case, unsnapped the latches, and pulled out a beautiful, battered acoustic Gibson. He walked to the center of the dance floor, where the linoleum was scuffed and worn. He didn't need a microphone. He didn't need a band. He had a voice that had traveled around the world. "I didn't bring a toaster," Neil announced to the crowd, his eyes twinkling. "I hope this is okay." He strummed a single chord. It rang out, rich and full, silencing the murmurs instantly. He began to play, not one of his high-energy anthems, but a soft, slow ballad. He sang "The Story of My Life," his baritone voice filling every corner of the room, bouncing off the cheap decorations and turning them into gold. He sang directly to Gabriel and Elena. The couple, mesmerized, began to sway. It was a first dance that billionaires couldn't buy, a private concert in a room that cost $200 to rent. Maria sat there, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. She looked at her boss, this man the world worshipped, and she saw him singing for her son. It was the ultimate validation. All the years of scrubbing toilets, of missing dinners, of being invisible to society, it was all redeemed in this single song. He was telling her without words that her life mattered, that her family was worthy of his art. When the ballad ended, the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then someone clapped, then another, and then the room exploded. But Neil wasn't done. He looked at the teary faces, the emotional weight in the air, and he decided to shift the energy. He strummed a familiar upbeat rhythm. Dun dun dun! A spark of recognition lit up the eyes of every person in the room, from the grandmother in the wheelchair to the toddlers running around. Hands touching hands. Neil sang, his voice picking up power. The crowd gasped. It was the song. Reaching out, touching me, touching you. "Sweet Caroline!" Neil bellowed, and the room erupted. "Ba! Ba! Ba!" The crowd screamed back, a chorus of 200 voices joining the legend. Suddenly it wasn't a performance, it was a party. Neil walked into the crowd, guitar strap over his shoulder. He sang to the bride's mother. He high-fived the terrified DJ. He danced a little jig with Maria's aunt. The barriers of class, race and fame were obliterated by the music. For 3 minutes there were no rich or poor, no famous or unknown. There was just the rhythm, the joy, and the shared humanity of a wedding celebration. People were standing on chairs, waving napkins, crying and laughing at the same time. Neil finished the song with a flourish, sweat glistening on his forehead. The applause was deafening, louder than some stadiums he had played. He bowed, not like a star accepting worship, but like a performer grateful for an audience. He walked back to Maria, who was now standing, sobbing openly. He put his arm around her. "You did good, Maria," he whispered to her while the room cheered. "You raised a good man, and you throw a hell of a party." He handed the guitar to his driver, who had stepped in, and then he picked up the wrapped gift he had brought. He walked over to the head table and placed it in front of Gabriel and Elena. "Open it," he said. Gabriel tore the paper. Inside was a check for an amount that would pay off Gabriel's student loans and put a down payment on a house. The young man looked at Neil, speechless, his knees weak. "No, Mr. Neil, we can't," Gabriel started. "It's not from me," Neil interrupted, his voice firm. "It's from your mother. She earned this, every penny. I'm just the delivery boy." He turned to the room, raised a glass of cheap champagne and toasted. "To Maria, the woman who runs my life so I can live it." "To Maria!" the crowd roared. For the first time in her life, Maria was the center of attention. She wasn't the help. She was the hero. She looked at her son, debt-free and starting a new life. She looked at her boss, who had humbled himself to elevate her. And in the middle of that humble hall in East LA, amidst the smell of pork and the sound of cheering, she felt richer than any queen on a throne. The departure of Neil Diamond was as graceful as his arrival, but it left a vacuum in the room that was instantly filled with a frantic, joyous energy. He didn't rush out like a celebrity escaping the paparazzi. He said his goodbyes to the elders, shook the hands of the waiters, and kissed the bride on the cheek. As he walked toward the exit, the entire room stood up, not because they were told to, but because they felt compelled to honor a man who had honored them. When the heavy metal doors of the community hall closed behind him, and the sleek, black limousine glided away into the twilight of East Los Angeles, disappearing past the taquerias and the auto body shops, the spell didn't break. It solidified. People looked at their phones, staring at the blurry photos and shaky videos they had taken, trying to prove to themselves that it hadn't been a fever dream. The check sitting on the table with its zeros and its signature was the tangible proof that their lives had changed, but the feeling in their hearts was the real currency. For Gabriel and Elena, the night continued, but the texture of it had shifted. They weren't just a young couple starting out with debt and hope. They were a couple who had been blessed by a legend. The money from the check bought them a small house in a safe neighborhood, a place with a yard where their future children could play, far away from the cramped apartments Gabriel had grown up in. But more than the house, the gift gave them a story. It gave them a legacy. Every time they faced a hardship in their marriage, they would look back at that day and remember that kindness exists, that miracles happen, and that even when you feel small and invisible, someone might be watching who thinks you are worth singing for. Maria returned to work at the Bel Air mansion the following Monday. She took the bus, then the transfer, then the walk up the hill. She entered through the service entrance, put on her uniform, and tied her apron. But something was fundamentally different. The house didn't feel like a museum of someone else's life anymore. It felt like a place where she belonged. When Neil came down for his coffee, unshaven and wearing his bathrobe, there was no awkwardness, no master-servant distance. He looked at her and she looked at him, and they shared a smile that contained the secret of that magical Saturday. "How are the newlyweds?" Neil asked, stirring his coffee. "They are looking for a house, mister." "Neil," Maria replied, her eyes shining. "Because of you." "Because of you, Maria," he corrected gently. "Never forget that." Years rolled by. The music industry changed, tours came and went, and Neil Diamond eventually retired from the stage due to health reasons. The stadium lights dimmed, and the roar of the crowds became a memory. But in the quiet of his golden years, the memory of that wedding in East LA remained one of his brightest moments. He often told friends that no standing ovation at Madison Square Garden ever felt as good as the hug he got from Maria's uncle or the taste of those homemade tamales. He realized that fame is a lonely mountain, but connection is a warm valley, and for one afternoon he had come down from the mountain to dwell in the valley. Maria continued to work for him until she physically couldn't anymore. When she finally retired, Neil didn't just give her a pension, he bought her a comfortable condo near her son, ensuring she would never have to worry about rent or safety again. He visited her, not as a boss visiting a former employee, but as an old friend. They would sit on her small porch drinking tea, talking about Gabriel's children, who were now growing up hearing the legend of the man in black who came to the barrio. To those grandchildren, Neil Diamond wasn't a rock star, he was Uncle Neil, the nice man with the deep voice who saved their family. The story of Neil Diamond attending his housekeeper's son's wedding became a modern legend in Los Angeles. It was whispered in kitchens, told in break rooms, and shared among the invisible army of workers who keep the city running. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder that humanity can bridge any gap, that empathy is stronger than social status. In the end, the true measure of the icon wasn't his sales records or his Grammy Awards. It was the fact that he saw the woman who cleaned his floors not as a utility, but as a mother, a hero, and a friend. The song Sweet Caroline might be about a specific woman, but on that dusty floor in East LA, it became an anthem for everyone who had ever been touched by an act of unexpected grace. And even today, if you go to that neighborhood and ask about the wedding, the old-timers will smile, point to the community hall and say, "That's where the solitary man became one of us." The music faded, the limo drove away, but the love he left behind grew roots that would last for generations.